All right, recording in progress. It is such an honor to be with all of you tonight. Thank you so much for having me. And just as a bit of a Zoom housekeeping note, I would greatly appreciate if folks could kindly mute when they're not speaking to kind of avoid feedback, and any feedback that you may hear from my screen reader. You may hear a very, very fast voice talking. Don't worry, that's my screen reader and it's all good. But I just always let people know, because for me, it's completely second nature. But for a lot of folks who've not heard it before, they're jarred at first. They're like, what is that? So I just wanted to preempt that. And I am so delighted, truly honored to be with all of you tonight. And we're going to be talking about kavod habriot, or human dignity. We're focusing on disability, but I want to give a couple of disclaimers and framing by way of introduction to what we're doing tonight and why I think this is so important. So the first thing I want to say is I just said we're going to be focusing on disability, but I have to qualify that a little bit to say that the text that we're going to be looking at tonight, we have two of them. We're probably only going to look at the first one, but we may get to the second text. The two texts that we're looking at tonight are both from the Babylonian Talmud, which is the more authoritative of the two Talmuds. The other one is the Talmud Yerushalmi, which was written and edited in the land of Israel. And the Babylonian Talmud was mostly compiled in Bavel, which is also, modern day Iraq. And the Babylonian Talmud was finished, roughly compiled around between the 5th and the 7th centuries of the Common Era. And it is the Talmud that is most often studied, although there is renewed interest in the Yerushalmi, which is really exciting as well. And so these two texts from the Bavli, they're both what we call Agada, which feels really appropriate to talk about Agada this time of year because we're coming up to Pesach, and Agada and Haggadah share a similar root. Both of them have to do with telling or stories. But I believe that both of the texts we're going to be looking at are stories with a larger goal. Of course, I am a 21st century rabbi, thinking about these things with a disability perspective. I cannot and would not claim that the texts in their own context are thinking that way. What I think is really important, though, for us to be conscious about is the ways in which both of these texts, and particularly the first text, situates a person who is mistreated and makes a really profound theological claim about that individual through both their actions and how the story is ultimately presented. And the fact that we have this in the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled 1,500 years ago, is astounding. And it's astounding because I think that there's often this idea that time is inherently linear. There's a very, Western concept of time is linear and we're always moving towards progress, which I think that we can all imagine that is not exactly an accurate way that time progresses in the world. But with regards to Jewish text, there is sometimes a strain of thought that says, well, the Torah has all of these negative things to say about disability, and thank goodness we don't live in that world anymore. And so these texts we can kind of put over here, we can kind of put them aside and not really pay attention to them because they reflect a time and a place that is completely different than ours. And what I always say in response to that is that while it's absolutely true that in terms of the social cultural location that the texts are written in, that being vastly different, it's also important to note that a lot of the content is relatable. That these are not things that we can just put aside and not pay attention to. And as someone who is committed to a life of Torah, that's not an option that I am interested in engaging in personally. So that means that for me, I have to grapple with texts on their terms. I have to grapple with my own responses to those texts in a spiritually mature way and figure out what does it mean to be in an ever-evolving relationship with Torah writ large. That doesn't mean that it's always easy. I think that by its very nature, that relationships are multi-pronged, that it's not simple, it's not always straightforward, it's not always easy. We have times of real struggle. But part of what it means to be part of a tradition that talks about a living Torah, a Torah Chaim, a life-giving Torah even, is that we are the inheritors of a very rich, complicated tradition, and we get to be part of that conversation. We are not passive observers. We are active contributing participants. And so how we're going to understand the text we look at tonight is going to be very different one from another. I'm sure that even in this room right now, we're all going to have vastly different reads, and that's great. I do not claim that my current understanding of the text is definitive or absolute. What I am suggesting instead is that the way that I think about text is one particular way that this text can be understood. I have heard the particular text we'll be looking at, which I'll describe in a moment, I have heard it taught from a variety of angles. And I'm going to be drawing on my own experiences. I'm going to be drawing on some of the Torah of my teachers, particularly Rav Tali Adler at Hadar, who also taught this text a few months ago really beautifully. And I'm going to really, and as well as Rabbi Dr. Bert Vysotsky, who is a mentor of mine at the seminary, and some of you may be familiar with his work as well. He actually was instrumental in introducing me to the text we'll be looking at tonight. And I cannot thank him enough for just the ways in which this text has completely changed my life in a really dramatic way. So with that being said, we're now going to transition into the text. And the way that the evening's going to go, the way the next bit of time is going to go, is that Rabbi Marder is going to share her screen. And I am not going to be reading this text word for word. I am going to be instead doing what we in rabbinics call an outside translation, which effectively means I'm going to tell you the story. I'm not going to read you the story. I find it's a much more engaging way. And also for those who are able to access the screen share, you can follow along there. And for those for whom that's challenging, it's posted on the website and it's easily downloadable there as well. And because we are a content-oriented session and not a skills-oriented session, we're not going to be spending time dissecting all of the particularities in the actual text. We're going to be focusing on the content. So by way of introduction, we're going to be first looking at a text from a tractate in Talmud called Ta'anit. This text is on the 20th folio, and in the Talmud, every folio, every daf, which is the Hebrew word, has two amudot, two sides to it, 2 pages to it. We're going to be looking at a text that is on the 20th daf of Masechet Ta'anit. If any of you are engaged in any way with Daf Yomi, Ta'anit was a few months ago now. And it is a really fascinating tractate. It's a short tractate in the Seder of Moed. And Moed is the Seder. When I say Seder in this context, I'm talking about an order of tractates, of Masechtot in the Talmud. And Moed is a broad category that encompasses all of the holidays, basically. So everything, of course, from Pesachim, which is a big tractate in Seder Moed, to Sukkot, to Sukkah, to Ta'anit, which is about fasts, to Megillah, which is all about Purim, which of course we just celebrated a few weeks ago. And in the tractate called Ta'anit, most of that tractate is actually concerned with what happens when rain does not fall in its appropriate time. This was a huge problem, of course, especially in the land of Israel, because if it doesn't rain during the rainy season in the land of Israel, farmers were incredibly dependent on the rain. And if there was no rain, that was a real dramatic challenge. And so the rabbis try to figure out, so what happens if it doesn't rain when it's supposed to? At what points do you start calling a fast? And that's what largely interests Tractate Ta'anit. But there's a chapter, the third chapter, which is one of my favorite chapters in general in Talmud, which has a lot of very famous stories about sages and other individuals some of whom engaged in a lot of acts of generosity. One of the very famous story cycles in that parak is Choni HaMa'agel, Choni the circle maker, which is just a beautifully poetic and lovely and rich cycle. And the text that we're going to be looking at tonight is situated in that chapter. So before I start talking about this story itself, I want to make a couple of notes. I'm going to be, as I'm describing and walking us through the text, I'm going to be stopping and engaging in some commentary. And what I would love to do, or what I would love for all of you to do, is just to be holding your questions. You can either put them in the chat. I am not able to access the chat when I'm teaching, so Rabbi Marder, if there's anything that arises, particularly a technical question that needs to be addressed immediately, please interrupt me and ask me. Any kind of content questions, I want to hold for Q&A and discussion at the end. And I would like to get through this text in its entirety first outside, meaning I'm going to tell it, and then we're going to pause for a lot of discussion and back and forth. And I think it's going to be extraordinarily rich. And then if we have time, we'll get to the second text. If we don't have time, then I encourage you to read that text on your own time. So this particular text is sometimes known as the story of the ugly man. And I want to pause there and note that the individual who is called ugly is not named. And in our own modern day, in our moment, in our social location as people in the United States and in our own particular period of time, something that we have come to understand is that when someone is not named, it often means they don't have a lot of significance. Now, this text, I think, turns that on its head, but I think also the fact that this man is not named, but merely described, is something that we need to take a lot of care to think about. How does that affect how we think about other people? And we'll get there in a little bit. But the other main character is Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. And Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is the son of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And that's very important because Rashbi, some people may know Rashbi as the individual to whom the Zohar is attributed, which Jewish religious tradition for the better part of 1,000, maybe a little less than 1,000 years, has attributed the Zohar to Rashbi for a variety of reasons. And Lag BaOmer is a very important day in terms of people going to Har Meron, and we know last year was the incredible tragedy there. But Rashbi in the Gemara is someone who is known more for his being in a cave for many, many years learning Torah with his son Elazar, excuse me. So one thing to know about Rashbi is that when he emerges from the cave the first time, he's really angry because he doesn't think that the people that he encounters are actually engaging in Torah the way he thinks they should. And he has his eyes become like lasers, and Hashem basically says, if you're going to destroy everything you encounter, you need to go back into the cave for a bit. So Elazar has been with his father for this time, and we don't know, there's no indication in this particular text how long this text occurs after they emerge from the cave. But just thinking about this biographical detail, he's been in the cave for a long time, and that inevitably affected his life. So the main folks we're going to be dealing with tonight are Rabbi Elazar and Reka, or the ugly man. So the way that this story gets framed is that Rabbi Elazar is framing it as a teaching story to his students. And he says that you should not be hard, you should not be hard like a reed, excuse me, hard like a cedar and soft like a reed. You need to be like a reed and not like a cedar. And then he describes this particular occurrence. So one day, Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is on a donkey, and he's riding home from Migdal Gador, where he's been learning with his rabbi all day. So quick pause here is that Migdal Gador is as much a geographic location as it is a descriptive location. And I think for our purposes, the descriptive location is more important. Migdal Gador literally means the great tower, like the mighty tower. So you can kind of imagine this as Rabbi Elazar was in the ivory tower all day. And we might notice some associations we have with that, with an ivory tower mentality or an ivory tower existence, but just noting that here the story is presenting us with this idea that Rabbi Elazar was spending his day in a very elite educational environment. And he's feeling really great about himself because he's learned a lot of Torah. So he's riding home on this donkey. And on the road, he approaches a man who we don't know anything about this man. We don't know anything about his appearance other than it was ugly in the eyes of Rabbi Elazar. I imagine, again, we don't know from the text, but I imagine that perhaps there was some kind of visible disfigurement, some kind of visible, what we would call today disability, which was certainly not the term that was used then, but is the term that is used now. But whatever that was, it was discomforting to Rabbi Elazar. And this man approaches Rabbi Elazar and says, "Greetings, my rabbi." Now, we're not totally sure how he knew that Rabbi Elazar was a rabbi, but that being said, he greets him. And in response, Rabbi Elazar does not return the greeting and instead says, "Ugh, ugly, Reka, are all of the people of your village as ugly as you are?" So pause for a moment. This is really a stark response, right? I mean, imagine this. You're on the road, you're minding your own business. And then all of a sudden, you just want to exchange a simple pleasantry with somebody. And what do they say in response? Ugly. Are all the people of your village as ugly as you are? So if we're putting ourselves into this text, a lot of us, I can imagine, we're all really taken aback. Why would you say something like that? So what this man does, this is I think one of the best lines in the text. What this man does in response is says, well, if that's how you think about me, if you think that I'm just this ugly person and you wonder if all the other people in my village are as ugly as I am, then maybe you need to go and have a chat with the craftsman, capital C, who created me, and say to him, and say to them, "Ay, how ugly is the vessel you made?" So this is a profound theological claim. This man has been horribly insulted. And, it's very hard for me to read this dispassionately, right? Because it's very easy to think like, what would I do? I know what that kind of insult feels like, right? How does one respond? And in this text, he responds by saying, well, if you are going to if you're going to treat me that way, then go and have a chat with the divine craftsman, the one who creates all, the one who made all of us in God's image, B'Tselem Elokim, and say to Hashem, how ugly is the vessel you made? Says the gentleman, I'm going to say gentleman or man, not ugly man, because I want to try to give him kavod, but it's as though he's saying, you cannot claim that the spark of the divine that I have within me is any less than the spark of the divine that you have within you. And presumably, we don't know for sure, but I imagine there's also a little bit of a literary license happening here where the gentleman knows that Rabbi Elazar has been learning Torah all day. So really just hits him where he's going to have to take notice. You've been learning Torah all day, and yet you walk out of Migdal Gador, out of that elite ivory tower, into the street, and the first thing you say to another being created, B'Tselem Elokim, created in the image of God, that you claim to love and study and connect to and worship, that I'm ugly, and that all the people of the village must be as ugly as I am, and that I am somehow beneath you, then go and have a chat with Hashem and say that. So Rabbi Elazar realizes that he has made a grievous mistake, and he gets down off of his donkey and he prostrates himself and he follows the gentleman. And they keep going towards Rabbi Elazar's town. But as he's prostrating himself, he's begging for forgiveness from this gentleman. Now, do we know whether or not he fully understands the severity of what he's done? It's really hard to know. There are a lot of ways we can read that. But be that as it may, he's in this supplicatory position. He's prostrating himself. He's asking for forgiveness. And the man says, no, I won't forgive you until you go and have a chat with the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? So they arrive at the town, at Rabbi Elazar's town, and there's a throng of people who've come out to greet him. And they say, greetings, my master, my rabbi, my master, my master. And again, the gentleman says, who are you calling my rabbi, my master, my master? And the townspeople say, well, of course, Rabbi Elazar. And the other gentleman says, well, but Rabbi Elazar did this thing to me on the road. And in response, the gentleman said, and they say, well, the gentleman says, Rabbi Elazar did this terrible thing to me on the road. How are you calling him my rabbi, my master, my master? And the townspeople say, oh, well, can you please forgive him because he's such a great Torah scholar? And the man says in response, I will forgive him as long as there are not many like him among the people of Israel. And we end the text with a framing that one needs to be soft like a reed and not hard like a cedar. And it's because of the reed's softness that the reed merited to become quills for the scribing of tefillin and mezuzot, whereas the hard cedar is not used in that way. So there's a certain sense of, we need to have a sense of gentility and adinut and soft-heartedness. Now, again, there are a lot of unanswered questions here. Does Rabbi Elazar do tshuva? I think that is ambiguous. My read is that we don't actually know, but it doesn't appear so. And I am very happy to be challenged and pushed back on that. The question of how did the other gentleman behave? Was that aligned? Was that appropriate? Was it overbearing? I will say that there is a certain emotional satisfaction. When I have taught groups of people who identify as having disabilities or chronic illnesses, there is a certain deep, deep resonance with him, because we know that the world is often a very difficult and cruel place. And sometimes when we are honest about that, or about the insults that we experience, it is really hard for people to be able to hear that and for people to be able to process and integrate that. So when we're looking at a text like this, part of what we can do is use that text as a vehicle for thinking about the ways in which these kind of dynamics show up in our own human interactions, whether it's disability related, whether it's bullying, whether it's other forms of discrimination, including racial discrimination, all of the ways in which human beings can so awfully mistreat one another. And of course, we are living in very difficult times right now, and we know all too well the depths to which human beings can go to mistreat one another. But there are questions that are his behavior here. And what is his larger theological claim? And is there a broader message that we can take from this in terms of thinking about human dignity? So I want to pause before offering more of my reflections to just open it up to anyone who has any questions you want to share. And Rabbi Murder, I will turn it to you in terms of if you'd rather call on people or read the chat or mute or unmute, whatever you feel is best.
Great. I have a couple things to say, but I want to open it up to others first.
Rabbi,
David. Yeah.
the ending is very ambiguous.
Mm.
I mean, it sort of leaves one, it's almost unclear who Rabbi Shimon is talking about. Is he talking about himself, or is he talking about the quote unquote ugly man who didn't forgive him?
Mm.
Diuk, exactly. Yes, that is extremely ambiguous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly part of the point, which is why I think we still are left with the ambiguity of did he actually do tshuva? Because we don't actually know, given how this ends, right? We don't know if he actually really understood what happened here.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or is he talking about both? He
Right.
and right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I was going to say, when you were talking about the place that he came from, the Migdal Gedor, he's also on a donkey, which he's sort of high up in that way, but he has to come down. He has to humble himself when he realizes, how he's misspoken. And, it was very helpful that you spoke about his childhood or his younger adult years living in that cave when his father comes out and, in Tractate Shabbat, and he has those laser eyes. This feels like the same version. His version of laser eyes is his cruelty toward the ugly man. He's insulting creation. He's destroying that which he sees. And it's God's creation. And so it's really an interesting parallel story to the cave story. I never thought about that. And essentially he's told, go back to where you came from, go back to your high place up there with God or in a study hall somewhere. You're not really for this earth. You're not really for being down here with human beings because you have no manners and you're a jerk.
Yeah. And I so appreciate you drawing that parallelism because I hadn't thought about it quite as expansively as you just offered. But I think it's true. I think it's a direct parallel to the cave story. And for folks who aren't as familiar with the cave story, it's as I kind of described in the beginning, there's this story in Tractate Shabbat of the Babylonian Talmud where Elazar and his father, Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, are in this cave and they're learning Torah and they're sitting in this cave up to their necks in sand and they have like nothing but a single garment. And I don't remember how they got their food. I think it was probably Rashbi's wife, but I don't recall, but I'm imagining that's what it was. They're basically living this very austere life. Of course, they are deeply dependent on making sure somebody gives them sustenance. But then they leave the cave, and then they destroy, and then Rashbi destroys everything he sees, and that's why he's brought back in. And I so appreciate your drawing out that this is exactly the same thing. It's just that he is destroying, that Elazar is destroying a human being in a deeply awful way,
and using Torah as a sort of weapon.
Yeah.
His title as rabbi or his superior knowledge, sort of weaponizing that. And then calling the other man a reka, empty, like he's an empty vessel, judging his, if that's what you look like on the outside, then I imagine you're empty on the inside.
Yeah. And what I love so much about this text and how I relate to it and why I love teaching it, it's one of my favorite texts to teach, is because we might think that this is really over the top, but there are so many people in this world who experience this every day. What is the spiritualness about how we as Jews and we as human beings are asked to behave? This is clearly, I think, by the way the dialogue is described, even if the ending is deeply ambiguous, which I think it is, I do think that the Talmud is saying, this is not okay. This behavior is not okay. And we have to be reminded of that because it's very easy for us to forget that.
And what do you make of, say, the townspeople? I mean, I think in this group, I'm just looking around, such wonderful people in this group and in our community. I haven't witnessed, and maybe others have, but I haven't witnessed someone insulting someone in that way. And yet there are other characters who are sort of bystanders. What do you think we can learn from the townspeople?
I think that the townspeople, from my perspective, and I'd love to hear what others think as well, I think the townspeople act the way a lot of us do when somebody that we really respect does something wrong, right? I mean, think about how and I mean, we all do it, right? I think it's a deeply human trait. We don't want to deal with the reality that someone that we have a lot of respect for or deep affection for or whatever has behaved in a way that we find completely out of character. So we'll make excuses or we'll justify it or we'll say, oh, well, it couldn't have been that bad. So I think the townspeople are acting in a really human way. It's not ideal, but I think it's actually how we act most of the time as people. I think we always want to strive for better than that. But I think that we have here a very honest, in my view, a very honest, an honest experience that people have. It's not the only experience by and large, but it is an experience.
Yeah. Great. I'm not seeing, Alana, yes.
I was gonna say, I thought that part was really interesting. It was almost like you said, like the defensiveness. And I feel like that was very relatable. This, especially like in the news, we see this a lot, like the defensiveness to say, whether it's about people commenting about disability or race, about saying, oh, well, they didn't mean it, or it couldn't have been that bad, or, oh, but they do good things, or they give to this charity, like you should give them a break. And I thought that part was I thought the fact that he did kind of give him a break and say, okay, well, as long as, I actually kind of thought that it sounded like he got off kind of easy in the end, because the truth is, there's an assumption that someone who studies Torah, who's a rabbi, will be kind and will know not to say something so explicitly horrible. But then he gets off easy, and I guess the question is, will the teaching actually continue and actually have an effect in the end? I don't know. I feel like that ending was surprising to me, but the defensiveness was definitely something that I thought was interesting, and I like the way that you framed that.
Yeah, thank you, Alana. I resonate with everything you've said there, and particularly when it comes to the defensiveness piece, right? Like, it's all over the media and all over the news, right? That we experience this all the time. And then what happens often, it's like, I would love to have like a part 2, 3, 4 of this story, because we don't actually know what happens to the ugly man at the end, right? He just he says his grand, it's kind of like, I imagine it's like a grand exit. Well, if you're going to accept him as your Torah teacher, well, I really hope there aren't many people like him among the people of Israel. And then I kind of imagine him just kind of walking off, right? Like, all right, I made my point, I'm out of here. But it's like, we don't actually know what happens to him. How does this story end? And that's so often true. How many times do we hear the beginning of a story, whether it's in our own communities, in the news, in our families, wherever, of some grievous encounter? We never know how it ended. So it's so easy to get into this place of like, oh, but this person was really good to me. I can't believe they did this other thing. And the truth is, like, we human beings are complex people. We're complicated. We make all kinds of irrational choices. So the defensiveness, I think, is really human. So our role, I think, and this is what our tradition really asks us to do, one of the things that I love most about Torah is that we are never meant to be complacent. We're always trying to strive to be better people every day. We get an opportunity to return again to that goal every single day. And here is yet another way of exercising that. Like, oh, what is this text showing me about proper derech eretz, about proper human conduct? How can I better my own being? How do I show up in ways that are generative and constructive and life-giving, and really make sure that people that I'm encountering feel good and, like they matter?
Yeah. Mindy, I saw you had your hand up. We cannot hear you.
That was because I was following a request. I was listening to that, and the phrase came to mind, bimkom she'ein anashim hishtadel liot ish, and just I think the magnitude of our responsibility, that really to make the world a better place. And what we don't do counts. What we don't do counts as contributing to the problem.
Yes, right. The bystander effect, Minnie, that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, right? Like, I'm imagining, wouldn't it have been really wonderful if, like, one of the townsfolk had said, hey, that's not okay, Rabbi Elazar, but that's not what happened.
So all of the people contributed to it and were part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reminds me of, a football coach, when was it Sandusky, when all those when the abuses came out, and he had so many defenders. I mean, that happens obviously all the time in our society, but that effect of one's reputation or title or influence, power, money, what you were saying about defensiveness, Alana, that people just rush to their defense.
Actually, there's a Malcolm Gladwell book that talks about that story in it, and part of what they talk about is that people don't want to believe the truth, because a lot of times the lie, you default to truth, you default to believing people instead of trusting people. And so it's kind of similar here. Like, the default is that it's someone that they know, so they're defaulting to trusting. They talked about the story about the Michigan doctor also. Like, everyone who knew them and thought they knew him defaults to just trusting, because they think that there could be no way that he would say something this awful or would do something this awful.
Right. And even on smaller scales too, right? Which is why I feel so strongly personally, and I'm not always great at this myself, right? I'm a work in progress, as we all are, but something that I became very committed to in rabbinical school and beyond, based on, honestly, a lot of my own experience with people who others thought were great, and I was experiencing in very different ways, particularly teachers that I had as a kid, which is, I try to be very aware of the ways in which I can be activated, right? So if I'm in a situation where I'm one-on-one with somebody, or I'm teaching or whatever, I have to be very diligent about my own what's going on for me, so that I can show up for my work for other people in the best way. Because so often what happens is, if we're not paying attention to what's going on for us, then we're going to get ourselves in situations, whatever the work we do in the world is, we're going to get ourselves in situations where we're I don't even have the right words for it, but like, if we're not self-aware people and we're not taking care of ourselves, then we find all of these awful things that, keep coming out about different abuses. And just, there's so many stories that we could, unfortunately, we could spend many, many hours talking about all of them, but we'll use Sandusky as an example, right? Like, how we are so easily, put in positions where as his defenders, like, oh, but he couldn't do something like that, because we don't want to deal with the fact that people act in deeply destructive ways when they are not, when there's just so much brokenness, and they're not aware, and they're not checking in with themselves, and they're not taking time to take care of themselves, and they're not holding themselves accountable. That is the most important piece, holding ourselves accountable for our behavior. And that, I think, ultimately is what this story is trying to convey, that is the most important. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Every year in Elul, right, we think about doing the tshuva work that we do. The tradition says that Yom Kippur atones for sins between ourselves and Hashem only. Has nothing to do with the sins or the transgressions between ourselves and other human beings. Those are our responsibility. Our tradition demands a lot of accountability. That's our requirement. And that's one of what I think one of the most beautiful pieces about our tradition.
Absolutely. Don't see any other hands up, so that was wonderful, that part of the discussion. Rabbi Tuchman, back to you.
Yeah. So, you know, and thinking about this text, we've covered a lot of the points that I wanted to end us with. We're not going to move on to the second text because we only have a few minutes left, and I want to also open it up for any general questions that folks may have. The second text, I will give you a little bit of a primer. It is a story involving Rav Sheshet, who is a blind rabbi, and an issue around going and greeting a king. Actually, interestingly, there's a parallel between that text and the cave story and this text in that Rav Sheshet, his eyes become lasers and he ends up committing a violent act at the end by killing the man that has been bullying him, which that is a very difficult ending for a lot of folks. I think that in terms of, and I'm not excusing any kind of violent behavior, I think in terms of literary tropes, what's going on there is that Rav Sheshet is navigating a situation with someone who is extraordinarily awful to him. And there's a certain literary trope used to say, well, this person may not be able to see, but they are using their eyes in a particular way, which is not a trope that I would use today. I want to be very clear. This is not a particularly literary trope that I find appropriate, and it's not one that I would ever recommend to folks, but I think in its own context, I think the Bavli is making a very interesting statement. So if you do get a chance to look at that text and you want to send any comments, feel free to, you know, I'm sure we can find a way for that to get onto me and for that to be relayed to me. So I think my email address is on the source sheet, and I welcome any questions afterwards, but we're not going to look at that text tonight simply because we don't have enough time. But it's a really interesting text. And there are a couple of things that I really want to make sure we take away from this discussion that we've had. And one of the most important things that I so love about this text from Ta'anit is that the Reka is exercising his agency. He is not a passive participant. He is active. He is making very strong statements in his behalf. He is making a very strong theological claim. I would also suggest that this is very significant coming from the Bavli, in that we have this idea, I think, particularly today, that ancient texts are inherently ableist or have a lot of discriminatory attitudes towards people with disabilities. And we're about to enter a couple of weeks of Torah where we'll see some of that. And that is not the only story present. That in fact, we have texts like this that are dealing with an individual who in one form or another is not a mainstream person in society. And the theological claim made about him is that he matters infinitely because he's created in the image of God, just like everyone else. And as a rabbi and as a person with a disability, it can sometimes seem like in our world, you know, we think about we're all created b'tzelem Elokim. What a nice teaching. What a nice idea, right? Lovely that our tradition gave that to the world. But what does it actually mean if we start to unpack that? If we lived ki'ilu, as if we truly believed that everyone was created b'tzelem Elokim, in the image of God, then we would have to live in a world in which we said that every person mattered infinitely. And we'd have to structure our entire society in a different way. And all of the choices that we make would have to be reconsidered. Because if we really believe that every single human life mattered infinitely because we all have divine spark, then how we would treat one another would be very different. But human beings, we tend to categorize, we have hierarchy, and this is a deeply human text. And when I say deeply human, I'm not making a claim about authorship, although because we're working with the Bavli, it's a bit of a different situation than with the the written Torah, but there are traditionalists who would say that the Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the Babylonian Talmud and all other oral Torah, was also given on Sinai. So when we think about our sacred texts, there are lots of different views on how we are to think about them in terms of authorship and whatnot. But when I use the word human here, what I'm saying is that we Jews, we inherited a really rich tradition that does not sugarcoat itself. And that's not always easy. There are a lot of times when I was in rabbinical school and before and since, when I was learning a text and I would often think, I'm so glad I inherited a tradition that doesn't sugarcoat itself, but why am I sitting in this rabbinic class right now learning this really hard text? And that's an experience that I think anyone who studies Torah in any way, shape, or form can connect to. We're always going to find those pieces of Torah that are really hard. And part of what it means to have a dynamic relationship with Torah, this is something that Rabbi Martyr and I had the privilege of really digging into a very short time ago, is that sometimes you're going to find those texts that are just going to be so hard, and you're just going to want to cry and say, why is this here? And it's not to say that everything's going to have a nice and easy resolution. Not every text about disability or that could be considered about disability is a text like this one that has such a strong theological argument, right? There's stuff we'll be looking at more in a couple of weeks. That's really difficult. But part of what it means to have that relationship with Torah, for me, is that it means that part of the work is offering our own selves to the text and allowing that text to transform us. And sometimes what that means is being very angry at the text and really trying to figure out, what is our pathway here? How do we connect? And maybe we say, actually, this text, I just can't go any further with it. But Torah is so vast and so encompassing that there's a lot out there that we can hold on to. No one person, I think, can connect to every aspect of Torah. I don't think that's the point of Torah. I think the reason we all were at Sinai together to receive Torah, to kind of refer to my Eli talk a little bit, we were all there collectively, but we received the revelation in an individual way. We all heard the Aleph in Anochi. We heard the first Aleph in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the Ten Commandments, but we heard the revelation, we received it in a way that we could understand it, even as we collectively were there together. It was collective and individual at the same time. So when we navigate a deeply, an ancient tradition, a very vast tradition, and a tradition that spans almost every part of the globe that our people have lived at one time or another, we inevitably are going to bring a lot of our associations with us to the texts. And those texts that we read and we learn and we try to get that sustenance from are inherently, in my view, going to reflect the time in which they were written, particularly the commentaries and the codes and the Talmud and all of that. So how do we then, as people and as seekers, how do we connect? And that's ultimately what I want us to be coming away with, is two things. First of all, that the tradition has a lot of richness when it comes to thinking about human dignity. That's a central value, I believe, in our tradition. And this is one example of that. And that's something that we can use in our work in the world. And the second piece of what I think is so important to take away is that not everything we're going to learn is going to be easy. A lot of what's happened in this text, particularly the way that Rabbi Elazar treats this man, it's really hard to read. And one of Rabbi Martyr and my teachers, Rabbi Tali Adler, said when she taught this text that she thinks it should be on the door of every rabbinical school, and I could not agree more. This is one of those texts that's really meant to hold us accountable, whether we are in leadership religiously or not. I think this applies to all of us. And this is a part of what it means to be engaged in Torah, whatever we mean by the term Torah. I have no assumption about what that means to any of you. But what I do want to offer is that bringing our full selves to that text is really important, and it can unlock insights and it can change how we respond to the world around us. So I'm going to pause there But I want to thank you all so much. And I just want to, I know in our last few minutes, I want to open it up and hear if there are any more comments or reflections or questions that anyone has, or Rabbi Martyr, if you have anything else that you'd like to add as well.
I just find I've learned this text before, but every time I learn it, whoever's teaching it, I see so many insights. Whichever angle you look at this story, it's sort of endlessly. It's like a ma'ayan, like a spring. I was just thinking about how the rabbi is described as having gasa, like sort of fat, like his ego is huge because he's just filled himself up with so much Torah, and he looks down on the man and calls him empty, like he's so full of Torah, and yet he has no wisdom at all because he has no idea how to walk in the world. But he thinks he's so full and wise, and calling someone else empty. So just sort of all the literary sort of devices going on here. It's just a beautiful text, and very thought-provoking, raised so much. So does anyone else have any last comments or questions? Yeah. Wonderful.
Just to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love this text. It is so, as Rabbi Martyr, as you said, it really is a ma'ayan. It truly is a ma'ayan. And the more we dig into it, just the deeper that ma'ayan gets, right? And the more nourishment, and just all of the literary devices. I'm so glad you mentioned the rabbis called gasa, just all of, clearly the Talmud is making a very particular point here.
Yeah.
And may that be something that we carry with us in terms of how we arrive and show up in the world and whatever we do with our days.
Right. Never looking down on anyone. Really.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Rabbi.
you. Thank you all so much for having me tonight.
Right.